Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce you to the first in a series of lectures and seminars to take place over the coming 3 years on the interdisciplinary subject of evolution and the theology of cooperation, funded by the Templeton Foundation and jointly directed by Professor Martin Novak of the Program of Evolutionary Dynamics and myself, Sarah Coakley. I'm the Mallinckrodt Professor here at the Divinity School. This project aims, during a period of unfortunate new political polarizations between fundamentalist forms of Christianity on the one hand and secular evolutionary theory on the other, to develop a sophisticated new discussion across faculties at Harvard on the varieties of ways in which theism and evolutionary theory may be brought into creative conversation and relation, especially vis-à-vis the exciting new developments about the evolution of cooperation and altruism in biology, and how game theory in particular may throw light on these developments. It is in this current context of debate that we're particularly pleased to welcome our first speaker, Professor Jeffrey Schloss. Professor Schloss studied biology and philosophy as an undergraduate at Wheaton College. He did graduate work at both the University of Virginia and the University of Michigan and was awarded his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Washington University. He is taught at Michigan and Wheaton and is professor currently of biology at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. More recently, too, he's been teaching over a 3-year period a summer program at Calvin College with the philosopher Alvin Plantinga on nature and belief. He's the author of numerous articles on evolutionary biology, but in particular, for our purposes, he is the author or editor of 2 books, Altruism and Altruistic Love, Science, Philosophy, and Theology in Dialogue, and co-editor with Philip Clayton, who will be with us here next year as a visiting professor in our program, of a new book last year called Ethics and Evolution. He is going to speak to us today on the topic Virtue is its own reward, evolution, religion, and the interiorization of cooperation. Jeff.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a privilege to be here with you at the beginning of this program, looking at what has always been a central question in religious traditions and what has become a central question in biological science involving the origin and the sustenance of altruism in particular and cooperation in general. We've moved over the last 150 years from this Kierkegaardian meditation, from whence comes love, where does it have its origin and its source, to E.O. Wilson's, here at Harvard, comment a few years ago that this same issue constitutes, quote unquote, a central theoretical question in evolutionary biology. Now, what I want to do with you this afternoon is, first of all, set the context for this question. Secondly, describe some seminal and emerging approaches to the question, and then conclude with an integrative approach involving a number of different scientific perspectives and also views of religion. So, first of all, the context. The question of cooperation involves really at least three questions. First of all, the question of what we might call dyadic cooperation or reciprocity, cooperation between two engaging individuals. This can be represented by the classical prisoner's dilemma, although there are a number of other tools that we can use to represent this, where you have a partner. If you both cooperate with each other, you incur minimal risk. However, you don't know what your partner is going to do. If your partner cooperates, you actually do better by defecting. If your partner doesn't cooperate, you get a sucker's payoff if you cooperate, and you do better by defecting again. So no matter what your partner does, it turns out you do better by defecting. Well, that same logic works for your partner as well. Each of you do better by defecting, and that turns out to be the Nash equilibrium in this particular game. And one question is, how do we break out of that? What accounts can we give dyadic reciprocity or cooperation. But in addition to that, there's the question of group cooperation, or what's been called the collective action problem. There are a number of ways of describing this as well, but seminal treatment, which is, by the way, one of, if not the most frequently reprinted article in the natural sciences in the 20th century, is described by Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, which involves the observation that commonly held resource with corporate participation, a single individual can oftentimes get away with minimal impact and minimal detectability by not cooperating. But then escalation of that strategy results in a deterioration of collective action or the commons. And then lastly, and this is the issue that I'm most particularly interested in, would be the issue of sacrificial cooperation or altruism, a kind of cooperation that results in a detriment to the actor and benefit to the recipient. Now, I do want to make three qualifications about this last issue here. First of all, from a biologist's point of view, altruism is a question of consequences and not motivations. And by the way, this is not it doesn't involve a reductive paradigm at all. At whatever scale of biological organization we look at, it still represents a fascinating and a challenging problem of how biological organisms could engage in a behavior that was biologically subversive. E.O. Wilson has called this genetically self-destructive behavior. Secondly, I want to make a distinction between in-group and out-group targets of this kind of behavior. It's often associated with enemy love or loving those who are not the near and dear. And while that's the most dramatic manifestation of this kind of behavior, it's by no means the most common or the only available target of the behavior. It can be shown theoretically, and we'll see in a few minutes, that this behavior can manifest with the near and dear as well. And by the way, experientially, any of us who have worked to sustain a long-term relationship with a partner or a friend know that there are times when we need to love the near and dear as though they were enemies. And the theological tradition, by the way, of agape redeeming eros or phileo would figure in here. And then lastly, in fact, that last distinction, talking about agape, I want to say that altruism is not isomorphic with agapic love or caritas. Altruism is simply, may be construed as a behavior. Agapic love, which I take to be cherishing the being and unconditional commitment to the well-being of another, involves both an affective and a volitional component. So we shouldn't confuse these, although the former is probably necessary for the latter. Fair enough? Okay, now let's jump in. Well, first of all, I want to say one thing about the context of this question. One of the reasons this has become such a hot issue over the last several decades is statements like the statement of Michael Giseln: if natural selection is both sufficient and true, it is impossible for a genuinely altruistic behavior to evolve. Now, this tension is quite readily laid at the feet of evolutionary biology, but I want to suggest it's more long-standing and more general than that. And it's rooted in the Victorian transition out of, on the one hand, natural theology, which saw kind of engineering evidences of design in the natural world, but much more deeply, I think more profoundly, the romantic affirmation that somehow the world itself gave epistemically certain testimony to the role of love in nature. The phrase, love creation's final law. And with the Victorian transition, there was a disillusionment away from that confidence embodied in this famous statement of Tennyson: this round of green, this orb of flame, fantastic beauty, such as lurks in some wild poet when he works without a conscience or an aim. Man, who trusted God, was love indeed, and love creation's final law, in this famous phrase, though nature red in tooth and claw with raven shrieked against this creed. Well, the quote that I began with from Kierkegaard, by the way, from whence comes love, can be understood in this context not as a celebrative meditation, but as a genuinely anguished agitation. From whence does come love? Given the erosion of epistemic certainty, and of course Kierkegaard's solution to this is that one must believe in love. Otherwise, one will never become aware that it exists. And it's not actually a big jump from that starting assumption to the mirror image 100 years later by Garrett Hardin. We must start with the assumption of pure self-interest. And if this is wrong, we will find out. So two radically different starting points, which many people, by the way, have taken to be evidence of intrinsic conflict between science and religion. On the one hand, the informed empirical skepticism of science. On the other hand, perhaps the naive fideism of religion. And I want to suggest, in fact, a thesis of my talk today is this doesn't represent science and religion conflict. First of all, it only represents differing starting assumptions, and neither of these are intrinsic to science or religion, maybe more intrinsic to a Nietzschean view of the world. But secondly, I would suggest the ambiguity itself is intrinsic to the experience of life. She loves me not. And this ambiguity drives tensions within, not between the enterprises of science and religion. And as we're going to see in just a few moments, there have been some interesting emerging accounts within the natural sciences over the last few years that start with the other assumption, that start with the assumption of the existence of cooperation and genuine altruism, and then try to devise an explanation for it. Okay, so here we go. There have been several fundamental theoretical breakthroughs on which later work has been based in explaining the evolution of altruism. One was the notion of kin selection developed by William Hamilton, which simply posits that a sacrifice actually is evolutionarily sustainable if the degree of sacrifice is less than the benefit to the individual times the percentage or the index of genetic relatedness of that individual. By the way, one of the things that this insight was believed to have done is solve the problem of radical cooperation in social insects, which involve sterile castes working for the offspring of another with no offspring of their own. And it turns out that social insects have a unique genetic system called haplodiploidy, where sister workers have a 75% index of genetic relatedness, which is more than they would be related to their own offspring. And so on the basis of this, Robert Trivers actually made a prediction. He predicted that, and by the way, they're only 25% related to male larvae. So he predicted that worker ants would be able to sense the sex of the larvae and would differentially provide food for females over males. And it turns out in 11 different species, the ratio was about 3 to 1, corresponding to the 75%, 25% index of genetic relatedness. So this has been an extremely fruitful paradigm in evolutionary theory. We'll see in a few minutes that it actually has probably been overextended. Secondly, though, not all cooperation exists between kin. And so Robert Trivers developed the notion of reciprocal altruism with a similar cost-benefit logic. The degree of sacrifice should be less than or equal to the degree of benefit to the actor, not the recipient, times the likelihood of a compensatory return. Now, these two insights formed the foundation of what has been called the second Darwinian revolution, the genesis of sociobiology. And I want to suggest there are three things that have been characteristic of this emerging paradigm. First of all, at least in the early years, it was claimed to be explanatorily sufficient that kin selection and reciprocal altruism were adequate to explain virtually all social behavior. And an implication of that, by the way, is it was a kind of an eros uber alles view, that what we might call the various loves. Eros was something we would expect biologically, and agape, giving without expectation of return, was not. So I've already quoted this Gizon quote to you, but this is wonderfully encapsulated in a statement by Richard Alexander from his seminal work, The Biology of Moral Systems. I suspect that nearly all humans believe it is a normal part of functioning of every human individual now and then to assist someone else in the realization of that person's own interests to the actual net expense of those of the altruist. What this greatest intellectual revolution of the century tells us is that despite our intuitions, there is not a shred of evidence to support this view of beneficence, and a great deal of convincing theory to suggest that any such view will eventually be judged false. There do not seem to be any remaining reasons for regarding morality, as normally expressed, as necessarily self-sacrificing or for invoking anything other than nepotism and favoritism to account for human societal structure. So the first statement would be there's explanatory sufficiency by these two views of kin selection and reciprocity, or as Alexander says, nepotism and favoritism. But the second comment I want to make involves actually a rhetorical posture of these initial theories, which would involve what I would call a kind of an exegetical reductionism. And by this I don't mean a theoretical reductionism, the scientific attempt to find an efficient cause at the lowest level of organization. I mean the interpretation of the meaning of those that involves the attribution of telos or purpose, whereby everything else is interpreted in the light of a genetic telos. Let me give you an example. Instead of the words nepotism and favoritism, one might have used less latent words like family and friendship, which turn objects into subjects, and which, by the way, are open to theological reflection in terms of common grace and the natural loves. But it doesn't just stop there. I mean, a famous statement by Richard Dawkins is, everything exists for the gene. Genes themselves just are. And this isn't merely an artifact of 30 years ago sociobiology. More recently, David Barish has said, what appears to be altruism at the level of bodies can be plain old selfishness at the level of genes. Now, the interesting thing, rhetorical dimension of this is altruism at the level of bodies is just what appears to be the case. Altruism, what's going on at the level of genes is plain old selfishness. Well, we might express the same truth in opposite language. That, in fact, what's going on at the level of genes isn't plain old selfishness, it's metaphorical selfishness. And what's going on at the level of bodies is real altruism. This, however, I don't think is in any way intrinsic to the science itself. And it even dates back to this statement in the Don Juan in Hell chapter in Shaw's Man and Superman, where he says, ages of faith, ages of romance and of science are all driven at last to have but one prayer: make me a healthy animal. One might be true to the same insights of embodiment and the ultimate constraints of biological reality, and still and say this exactly in reverse. Ages of the organismal cry for healthy homeostatic functioning have given rise wondrously and progressively to faith, romance, and of science. So the bottom line here is not to try to resist the implications of the scientific data, but to be cautious about the rhetorical posture and representation of that data. Okay, well, lastly, in a sense, none of this matters too much because it's turned out to be that this original approach has turned out to be theoretically incomplete in a couple of ways. For one thing, there's been a fairly dramatic revisitation of the adequacy of kin selection. In fact, just a couple of months ago, E.O. Wilson had an article in which he shared his conversion to kin selection, riding from Harvard to Florida on a train when he read William Hamilton's first chapter. That's been first article. That's been the reigning paradigm and accepted to be the adequate explanation for social insects for 30 years. And it turns out there are a variety of reasons why it doesn't work. And there have been gadflies or iconoclasts criticizing that theory for the last 30 years. We can discuss it in the question session if you want. But it isn't adequate. And kin selection, by the way, has been picked up and dramatically misused by many non-biologists, including political scientists who have wanted to use it as an explanation for group conflict. And there are solid theoretical reasons why that simply doesn't work and is untrue to Hamilton's original hypothesis. But perhaps more significantly is the anomaly of human altruistic cooperation. And neither of these approaches, kin selection or reciprocity, explain the manifest and widely extant behaviors in human cultures which have generated a second impulse or wave of theoretical elaborations. So here, let's take a run at this. There are three main traditions, and the first tradition is what we might call counter-benefit traditions. Traditions which recognize that altruism really is reproductively self-subverting in human beings. How can we account for that? Well, one of them is what the genetic lag or phenotypic plasticity hypothesis, which suggests that certain behaviors or the genetic predisposition towards certain behaviors arose in environments which no longer exist, and therefore they're vestiges. They haven't changed with the environment. Or the environment has changed in a way that has changed the phenotypic expression of the genotypes. In either case, what we have is a behavior that's reproductively subversive. Steve Gould has criticized these as just so stories, and in other places this is... But I would say that post hoc theorizing is a legitimate part of all scientific activity. So that doesn't make these theories untrue. They've also been branded with the epithet of Darwinian fundamentalism. And in one sense, I think that fundamentalism tag kind of works. Just as scriptural fundamentalism tries to explain the obvious errors of Scripture in terms of an inerrant autograph that we no longer have access to, so these accounts try to explain counter-reproductive behavior in terms of an originally inerrant beneficial behavior in an environment which we no longer have access to. Secondly, there are approaches which involve notions of manipulation. By the way, both of these have been invoked to explain the apparent anomaly of human adoption. Manipulation involves actually the Aristotelian notion of violence. Somehow an agent is coerced from its intended end into a behavior which causes it to deviate from its end. This, in fact, may be the case in many biological systems, but it raises a really interesting philosophical question. And that has to do with the inference of functionality or ends in biological systems. And there's an interesting circularity here, which the philosopher of science Elliot Sober is currently working on. And the circularity involves this. If we simply assume that the end of all organisms and all behaviors is reproduction, then any counter-reproductive behavior by definition becomes manipulation, and that turns out not to be much of an explanation, actually. Okay, lastly, and probably most promising in this approach is the notion of pleiotropy, or byproduct phenotypes, which may, in a sense, this could be behaviors or any other characteristic which are non-adaptive, but which piggyback on other behaviors which are adaptive. And there are a couple of different approaches. The most widespread approach takes notions of familial bonding and posits an expanding circle of attachment, whereby we become unconditionally invested, not just in genetically related kin, but in an expanding circle. That's a fascinating proposal, and most recently, Ernst Fehr has done some really interesting work in which he found that the hormone oxytocin, which is known to mediate familial, especially maternal, infant and pair bonding attachment, also increases trust in social games. So that's a really interesting finding. The problem with this view, however, is that empirical studies, and there are a number of them that have been done, of the most radical forms of altruism, don't show any evidence of affiliative attachment at all. It looks like something else altogether is going on there. And secondly, there are notions of the hijacking of social adaptations. This was Darwin's view, by the way. Hermann Simon, the Nobel laureate in economics a number of years, proposed that that humans are docile, that is to say, they're imitators of social behaviors surrounding them, and they also have a bounded rationality that involves the inability to calculate the outcomes of those social. And the first behavior, docility, is in itself adaptive, which along with bounded rationality results in altruism. There are a number of empirical challenges to this view, but most recently, a game theorist named Herbert Gintis has picked this up in an article in the Journal of Theoretical Biology and used this paradigm in terms of the internalization of moral sentiments. And Gintis argues that that can produce unconditional altruism, and that's a topic which I'm going to want to return to in a few minutes at the end of my talk. But it's a fascinating proposal. Okay, secondly, there are individual benefit approaches that don't view altruism as a pleiotropic, counter-reproductive behavior, but try to see ways in which apparent altruism isn't altruistic reproductively, ways in which it could pay off for the actor. The first suggestion in this vein by Richard Alexander in his Biology of Moral Systems involves the notion of indirect reciprocity, where I can do something for Martin even if he doesn't do something back, as long as that enhances my reputation and I'll get an indirect compensation in a social group. And a fascinating theoretical literature has grown up around this. In fact, Martin has made his own contribution to that, and there are a number of debates about what mediates reputation, whether it's image scoring, how much somebody gives, or whether it's honor or social standing, to whom one gives and whom one defects on, in what context. But the bottom line is, in Alexander's view, human behavior and even human moral sense is all about mediating the currency of reputation. Alexander says that conscience is a reputational bank account that goes off when we're doing something that erodes the capital of our reputation. And Alexander's popularizer, Robert Wright, in The Moral Animal, suggests that no parent really wants to teach their children how to be good. What they want to teach is how to be bad and get away with it. The Cornell economist Robert Frank has developed a much more nuanced version of individual benefit and has pointed out that, well, two things. First of all, humans cooperate in situations in social groups where we don't know one another's reputation. And secondly, we cooperate in situations where doing good could actually work injury to our reputation. And finally, he points out that human beings, most of us, would be suspicious of somebody who was only good to the extent that it was reputationally productive. So Frank has developed a theory of emotional signaling that involves the notion that we can do things which don't pay off and which have no rationally calculable payoff, at least in terms of our cognitive processes, but that do pay off. And so for those game theorists, he suggests that economic game theory that emphasizes rationally calculable self-interest works for indirect reciprocity, but it doesn't for emotional signaling theory. But evolutionary game theory, natural selection is a much better calculator than human cognition is. So that the bottom line is these human sentiments, which appear irrational in terms of self-interest, pay off. I mean, here's an example. If you're irrationally committed to revenge, somebody won't mess with you. Whereas if you will only resist a lawsuit, for example, to the extent that it pays off to resist it, the world's full of people who file capricious lawsuits knowing that it's too costly to resist them. Are you with me? So Frank's notion of emotional signaling involves actually, there's a virtue ethics involved here, that persistent behaviors, even if not observed, result in character cues which are efficacious in including one in a cooperative matrix. And in fact, we might ask the question, do humans have that capacity to see those kinds of cues? The psychiatrist Paul Ekman at University of California has done cross-cultural studies of facial recognition in over 100 different cultures, and it's really clear that in terms of fundamental emotions, humans have a fantastic ability to perceive interior disposition. But more recently, in a really interesting experiment at University of Michigan, they simply had people read Little Red Riding Hood into a video camera. And then they had these people take an assessment survey of how much, not just their attitudes, but also their behaviors, how much time they spent volunteering in soup kitchens or helping the homeless. And then they played these videos to students and had in dyads, in pairs, and had them rank them in terms of who was the most altruistic. And it turns out from just a video of people reading Little Red Riding Hood, there is a strikingly non-random ability to identify the person who was more altruistically involved. And in a later follow-up of a computer analysis of facial cues, it was found that there are a number of completely autonomic, hard-to-fake cues, like concern for furrows or smile symmetry, that were highly correlated. On the other hand, volitional cues, like eyebrow flashes, were uncorrelated. And one volitional cue was actually negatively correlated, the time spent per smile. So people who intentionally smiled longer were judged to be duplicitous and unaltruistic. Okay, well, lastly, if these hard-to-fake cues are so important for altruistic, convincing others of altruistic intent, perhaps the best strategy, and you can't fake them, well, then perhaps the best strategy would be to be persuaded yourself of your altruistic intentions, but have that persuasion be existentially uncoupled from your actual intent, which is called self-deception theory. Self-deception theory involves not the attribution of intentional hypocrisy, but the attribution of existential inauthenticity, or perhaps what Oscar Wilde has called sentimentality, the desire to have the pleasure of an emotion without the willingness to pay its price. There's a number of empirical observations which lend credence to this view. There's an extensive literature in social psychology of self-bias, the tendency to overestimate one's own beneficence and underestimate those of another. There's an emerging, which I'm not going to talk about, but fascinating account of the neurological basis for this kind of cognitive distortion. But I would like to say that one at present unexplored question is the relationship between evolutionary and psychological versions of self-deception theory and sociological theories of religious nominalization. Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman have called this the issue of invisible religion, and they argue that in certain cases of social development, the religious or sacred values that actually animate people's behavior is opaque and invisible, and the values which are said to animate behavior, the rhetorical or nominal religion, and nominal, by the way, not in the sense of being half-hearted. You may be deeply invested in it, but only invested to the extent that it names identification with a particular community. Well, this would be classic self-deception. The gap between what is the named set of religious values and the actual set of values that animate behavior. And in many religious traditions, by the way, the role of a prophet was to point out that gap, not to bring people back to orthodox professions, but to authentic internalization of the profession. And my take on this is that it's an extremely powerful reality in dialogue, in social dialogue today between various religious constituency. In particular, the debate over creation evolution can be seen as an argument over icons of belief, which are actually not instrumental in organizing one's behavior, but which have become iconically significant in identifying religious subculture or constituency, like the age of the earth, for example. Okay. Now, the problem with all of these is that while any of them may be true, and each of them probably are true in terms of describing the origin and the maintenance of some forms of cooperative behaviors, none of them appear to be sufficiently true. The last one, for example, self-deception theory, has a very straightforward empirical prediction. The empirical prediction is that the profession of commitment to altruistic behavior should be uncoupled from any actual altruistic behavior, and that doesn't seem to be the case. We have situations in human culture where individuals genuinely sacrifice their own interests for those of others, and the last tradition that has emerged to engage this is the tradition of hierarchical selection. The first form of hierarchical selection is could be construed of as a structural hierarchy. The units being selected, the information, or what Richard Dawkins called the replicators, are genes, but genes are replicated by and result in the phenotypic expression of entities that can be assessed at different structural levels of scale. The genome, the organism, a group, a population, perhaps even a biome. And while this has been evolutionarily unorthodox for quite some time, recent versions of it partition the variance or the difference in relative fitness into intra and intra-group components, so that one could be genuinely altruistic and have a lower reproductive success for someone in your social group, as long as the net contribution to the team, so to speak, enhanced the reproductive success of the group itself. A second distinctive is, contrary to earlier versions of group selection, this doesn't require an isolated reproductive population. All it requires is what David Wilson calls trait groups within populations that involve individuals who can simply influence one another by virtue of their behaviors. Now, what about an assessment of group selection? The upside is that on its own, it actually does make theoretically possible genuinely self-relinquishing behavior. And there's some interesting and recent empirical demonstrations of its efficacy. On the other side, Wilson himself says that the dark side of group-selected altruism is intergroup hostility. So, for example, terrorists flying into buildings on 9/11 would, on one view, be entirely altruistic, driven by group hostility, and by the same token, the sacrifices of firefighters who risked their lives, and then the very next day, I only saw this once on television, but the very next day had a banner the size of this wall out here at Ground Zero that said 5,000 reasons to kill them all. These examples would reflect the tensions in group altruism, genuine sacrifice driven by out-group hostility, at least in Wilson's view. To circumvent this, and lastly, the notion of functional hierarchy has arisen. Unlike structural hierarchy, where the replicators are genes, functional hierarchy involves a different form of replicator altogether that's being selected for. In this case, a non-genetic or ideational replicator. The term widely given to this is memes, but we don't have to get stuck on the term. And the two important aspects of functional hierarchy theory or cultural selection theory is that ideational replicators are irreducible to underlying genes, and perhaps more importantly, not only are they irreducible, but they're not epiphenomenal. They actually have causal efficacy. There's top-down causation, which may interact with genes in a number of ways. There's a wonderful treatment of this by Stanford anthropologist Bill Durham in his seminal book, Coevolution. And Durham points out that the interaction between these replicators can be synergistic, they can be independent, and sometimes they can even be opposing, where mimetic replicators actually inform or drive behavior that is counter-reproductive. So Joseph Lopredo picks this up in his Human Nature and Biocultural Evolution and argues that conceptions of a cultural nature, that we are open to conceptions of a cultural nature that thwart the self-serving thrust of the gene. The soul, principal among them, can be thought of as the kernel of an internalized morality, reinforced by fictitious forces whereby some humans are led to subordinate their genetic fitness and their self-interest in general to the fitness and interests of others, even strangers who are in no position to reciprocate. Thus, the concept of the soul has to some extent modified the genetic action of natural selection. Well, of course, this could be true of any idea, including calculus or optics by which eyeglasses are made. But the important point from Lopredo's point of view is that this notion of a transcendent, unseen reality that mediates and internalizes morality can actually get humans to do things that are not in their reproductive self-interests. Well, I mean, what about these ideas? On the one hand, they purchase us, or appear to purchase us, theoretical warrant for opening up the ground for counter-reproductive behavior. But on the other hand, many critics suggest that this is just kind of a magic wand. It's admitting that we can't explain it by traditional genetic selection. Gunther Stent, geneticist at UC Berkeley, has called this a biological absurdity that genes give rise to the capacity to resist genes. Franz de Waal, primatologist, critiques it as essentially a return to Gnosticism, where everything in our genes is bad and then something non-genetic is good and the source of virtue. And philosopher Mary Midgley says that her concern ultimately is that altruism becomes not a fulfillment of human nature, but a colonial imposition upon human nature. There are a number of empirical and theoretical questions as well, and I'd recommend Unger's book, The Status of Mimetics as a Science, for a real fair and balanced series of essays for, against, and agnostic on these theories. And finally, I want to finish up with an integrative proposal. I want to comment, first of all, that these notions that I've just described to you involve, I think, fascinating mirror tensions in science and theology. So on the one hand, you have notions of the possibility for expanding beneficence rooted in the genetically mediated natural affections. Although in those cases, there are intrinsic constraints on the domain of expansion. Can't get further than genetic benefit. And on the other hand, the mimetic tradition opens the ground for radical beneficence at the expense of uncoupling and even any proposal for how this relates to human biological nature. And in many respects, this represents an agapeist versus ladder of loves view in theology. Disagreements about the nature and role of transforming grace in human experience. Unlike theology, by the way, there's a paucity of integrative proposals right now, theoretically, for, to use theologically terms, how grace might not countervail but fulfill nature. What we have right now, point 3, is that all these proposals in some respects are fully Darwinian but non-organismal. The genetic approaches, and including some approaches to game theory, simply assume the seamless connection between certain behaviors and fitness without asking the question of the organismal mediation of behaviors or resource inputs into fitness. And mimetic approaches, of course, just leave that out altogether. So I want to spend the last few minutes exploring an integrative proposal. And I want to start with games as a heuristic tool. I am not a game theorist, by the way, and I'm in the presence of specialists, but I do think that they can be heuristically useful in thinking through some of these proposals. Martin has developed an approach to the prisoner's dilemma, which he calls generous tit for tat, involving the establishment of routine strategy in prisoner's dilemma of tit for tat. And then by making the population heterogeneous, allowing sources of error, it turns out that a patient or a generous tit for tat that will cooperate even in the face of perhaps a defection ends up being beneficial. And in the face of that, we actually can get unconditional cooperation. But once we get there, it's subject to invasion by wholesale cheating, which then gets us back to tit for tat. Now, interestingly, by the way, I think this is fascinatingly reminiscent of Max Weber's The Routinization of Charisma in terms of the cyclic cooperativity of religious communities. Now, one potential solution for that dynamic is punishment. And Ernst Fehr has done some fascinating work with the efficacy of punishment, where with punishment, cooperation is high, without it, it's low. He's actually, in a follow-up piece of work, done some really interesting work with neurological stimulation of the punishers in the act of punishing. This punishment, by the way, is altruistic punishment. It costs the punisher to effect the punishment, and it's pleasant to do. The pleasure centers of the brain are stimulated, and the more you punish, the more pleasant it is. Although the stimulation of pleasure centers is open to varied interpretations. Deviation from mean punishment, from mean cooperation, entails greater punishment. And then in an elegant and recent piece of work, Fehr looked at the effects of punishment in a different situation, not in a common situation, but in a dyadic situation, and actually found that in that case, forgiveness and not punishment provoked altruism. And that when a fine wasn't imposed, when it could be imposed, the dyadic cooperator cooperated more. Well, here's the bottom line, and there are many bottom lines on this, by the way, but two of the questions that emerge from this is, first of all, there's the observation that many individuals cooperate and, in fact, altruistically sacrifice in contexts where there is no punishment. And, in fact, they do so in contexts where there is punishment for doing so, thinking of the studies on Holocaust rescuers, for example. So we still need an explanation for that. Secondly, in any punishment situation, you have that punishes free riders. We have the question of secondary free riders, those people who don't punish. In fact, there are a variety of theoretical and empirical studies about that problem, but that's where I want to end up. One proposal for solving the secondary free rider problem, proposed by Dominic Johnson, a game theorist who was here at Harvard for a while now at Princeton, and also recently proposed by the anthropologist Chris Bohm, is that the cognitive internalization of supernatural sanctions can solve that problem, first of all, because if what matters is somebody's internal utilities. So you actually don't have to get punished if you think you're going to get punished. Are you with me? And secondly, it's cheap. Nobody has to bear the cost of punishing. It costs me nothing to send Sarah to hell if she treats me badly. And in fact, somewhat facetiously, Dominic Johnson has formulated it like this. If you go to heaven for cooperating and you go to hell for defecting, the Nash equilibrium is cooperation. In fact, we could modify this, nuance it a bit for perhaps a more Catholic view of things, where you just go to purgatory if you cooperate with somebody who cooperates with you. I mean, Jesus says, what credit is that to you? Even tax collectors and Gentiles do that. But sainthood comes if you cooperate with a defector. Or we could modify it again for a kind of a mean-spirited fundamentalist view of things where everybody's going to hell no matter what. But more seriously, this raises, and by the way, Dominic Johnson doesn't acknowledge this, but I think the only way to get this is by group selection. I'd love to talk with Martin about this, but it does seem reasonable that we could get this by group selection. I don't see how you can get it without group selection. But the problem is, you can get a tertiary cheater, a tertiary free rider, somebody who doesn't believe, but professes to believe. So William Irons has suggested religion as involving a series of costly displays or costly religious commitments involving the detection of tertiary free riders. And in fact, Richard Sosas has done some work on the longevity of religious communities. Most of them don't last very long, but religious are distinctly more long-lived than secular. And then the few that did last long, there's still a dramatic difference. Most recently, he's actually looked at the number of costly requirements of religious behaviors strongly correlated with the longevity of the religious community, which he cites as empirical confirmation of Irons' thesis. I would just suggest, though, that this is a correlation, and in fact, it's difficult to infer causality here. There could be concomitant causality, where the behaviors themselves are caused by ideological commitment, which is the basis for the longevity of the community. Okay, but there's the possibility of quaternary cheaters, where you could calculate how much costly religious display was necessary to be included in the social matrix. In fact, there's little question that some people do this, including church-going to be elected to political office, for example. So the next step here, and this is a step that has been explored by Joseph Bubulia, is to look at religious emotions as hard-to-fake signals of interior disposition. I'm particularly interested, by the way, in the history of ecstatic religious experience. And if we look at revivalist tradition, for example, it's ecstatic religious experience, perhaps the quintessential example of a hard-to-fake, although not impossible to fake, signal of interior disposition, is frequently associated with intense communitarianism from the New Testament church, everybody selling what they had, and expanding, by the way, to the Samaritan and finally to the Greek believers. On the rationale given is, well, the Holy Spirit fell on them just like it fell on us. The Azusa Street revival in the 1900s, perhaps the first breakthrough in interracial religious commitment in over a century. So that's a possibility, but it raises the problem of now quinquenary free riders, and that would be self-deception, self-deceived religious affect. And here's where I will close with the notion that evolutionary biologist Randy Nesse at University of Michigan has called intersubjective commitment, essentially involving a coupling of number 2 and number 3, behavioral displays along with hard-to-fake emotional signals. There's nothing dramatically new here, by the way. This is what Jonathan Edwards had in mind in his classic treatment of the religious affections during the Great Awakening. How do you distinguish authentic religious affect from deceived religious affect. Practice plus affect. Entailing, by the way, the proposal of deeply internalized benefits and unbearable cause. And by that I mean not that these feelings themselves, and this is Franz de Waal's, Antonio Damasio's view of emotions, that they're not just motivators, but they're mediators of internal states. And positive emotions have genuinely positive homeostatic outcomes. Negative emotions have negative homeostatic outcomes. And then close with a couple of examples of data which could suggest there's a research agenda here. First of all, Randy Nesse and Stephanie Preston have just finished up a fascinating study of longevity in terminal illness. We've known for a long time that involvement in support groups extends longevity, but what nobody has looked at is what you're doing in that support group. They actually found that those people, when controlled for degree starting pathology, that those people extending help have substantially greater longevity, and those people who are merely takers or dependents actually have reduced longevity. And David Larson, this work is open to question, but there are a number of studies which suggest that various measures of religious commitment itself have reductions of mortality and morbidity associated with it. But in a fascinating study, David Larson actually found that under certain circumstances, there's actually an increase in morbidity and mortality. And that's when you have religious conviction that you feel you have betrayed or aren't authentically living up to. And so lastly, I just want to conclude, am I proposing a new romanticism here? That somehow love really is nature's final law? In fact, I think there are empirical reasons for believing that it is more blessed to give than to receive, and that there is such a thing as genuine altruism. But I don't think it's as easy as just do good and it will pay off. The work for theological reasons, viewing the world as cruciform in nature, it's not that clear, but mostly for epistemic reasons. The distinction of genuine altruism from ingenuine in others and even in our own motivations is always hazy. Kierkegaard says, hypocrisy, artifice, wiliness, and seduction stretch unconditionally as far as love does. And they can imitate true love so strikingly that there is no absolute criterion, because in every expression of truth or of true love there exists the possibility of deception which corresponds to it exactly. Yet to cheat oneself out of love is the most terrible deception. It's an eternal loss for which there is no reparation. Thanks for your attention.
Would you be willing to take questions for a few minutes?
Sure.
Would you like to?
Just ask. Do you think that all internalized psychological motivators of altruistic acts are necessarily religious?
Depends what you mean by religious. If you mean theistic or supernatural, no, I don't. If you mean that genuinely altruistic acts that compel a person to pursue the interest of another person at substantial cost to themselves, my guess, both theoretically but in terms of the existing literature which studies that form of altruism, is that it's rooted in deep convictions about how the world works, convictions of meaning. And so and that's one view. If you take Clifford Geertz's definition of religion, which doesn't involve theism and doesn't even involve supernaturalism, but involves the conviction of an unseen reality which confers meaning to and orders life. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Should I speak loud? I was wondering how...
Can I say one more sentence about your question? The Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg says people can be pretty mischievous, but it takes religion to make them truly evil. I think there's truth to that. I just think it cuts both ways. That profound ideological commitments are powerful motivational levers, and they can motivate us to expend our own best interests. But there's no guarantee that what we expend them for is whether it's pro-social or anti-social. Although this article that I referred to by Herbert Gentis recently argues on the basis of several of the ideas that I just talked about, multi-level selection theory and cultural group selection, that the tilt is toward pro-social behaviors when deep values have been internalized.
I just wondered if you could, how this works in terms for women. For example, women who are pregnant and you have a child, actually a parasite feeding on them, and these emotional are manipulated hormonally through all sorts of hormones come into play, making them depressed, making sometimes even rejected, not loving the child, even killing it. So how do you explain this altruism that is biologically induced about the status of woman who actually gets pregnant and certain body fluids and hormones alter states of the mind? Is it just psychological or physically embodiment of love?
Yeah, that's a great question. And did everybody hear that question? How do we explain what the biological embodiment of altruism, for example, in the investment of a woman on behalf of the fetus or a young child? And there are actually several levels that one would want to look at that. First is the level of simply investment in progeny, which, while maybe motivationally altruistic, my son this year was almost killed in an automobile accident, and all the feelings of identification and pain that I had at his pain, I think in one sense genuinely valued and cherished him, but they weren't reproductively altruistic. That kind of investment is precisely what it takes, especially, by the way, in a species with young that require high amounts of parental provisioning. Okay, that's one statement. Secondly, however, there's a fascinating and emergent theory about conflicts of interest between offspring and parents. So parents, in fact, and by the way, any of you who have kids and have multiple kids live with this every day. So that parents, if in fact it's relative fitness that is generating these behaviors, should invest in children differently than an individual child would want, and in fact differently over the course of the lifespan. There ought to be greater investment in a child toward the end of a parent's reproductive lifespan, because the resources don't need to be saved for further reproduction. So that's the second one. But then, lastly, clearly there are cases of, and this is what I meant at the beginning of my talk, where radical altruism is not reserved for the out-group. In fact, we can love the near and dear with a love that is genuinely sacrificial, not just motivationally but consequential, even at the level of reckoning reproduction. But for that, it's not clear that natural selection at the level of the individual gene is an adequate explanation. And for that we need to enhance that with other explanatory approaches.
Thank you for your talk, and I want to ask a somewhat longer question. A central theme in the talk today is the keyword evolution. But at several points I find it a little bit ambiguous, whether you're referring to the kind of evolution that is already within human civilization or somewhat before the emergence of so-called civilization. Now, if we conjecture as a hypothesis that the human genome has been quite stable for the past, say, 100,000 years, then any kind of social formation, ideological formation cannot be passed through genes, can only pass through cultural values. And if we are talking about that time period, then we're certainly in the realm of social formation and realm of ideology and perhaps religion and perhaps culture. But if we're talking about the rise of altruism that can be traced all the way back to certain configurations of the genes, then we must be going back to the period before the 100,000 years. But in that period, then we're talking about something quite different. If we want to use words like culture and religion, we're talking about very different categories. But sometimes I find that you're jumping back and forth across the 100,000 years dividing line, and it's a little bit puzzling.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And a couple of responses. First of all, how much change has gone on in the human genome over the past 100,000 years, or even over the past 10,000 years, is a matter of no small amount of revisionist discussion right now. So I think that's an unknown. And there are several theories that suggest that much more change, well, the prevailing theory has been that once we got culture, there has been little genomic change. And E.O. Wilson, for example, says that although he's accused of being a genetic reductionist, he argues that virtually all the variance in extant human cultures has nothing to do with genomic evolution, and all the variance in patterns of human cooperativity. And so I would say, first of all, we don't know how much genomic change has gone on. Secondly, I almost think it's irrelevant, and back to your point, because forget 100,000 years or 10,000 years. Let's just look at the last 2,000 to 4,000 years. If we look at the history of religious traditions, although it's often suggested that this notion of radical altruism is central to who human beings are and what religions affirm, there's been a dramatically expanded vision of what it means to have right relationship with one's neighbor, from an eye for an eye to love your brother, to love your enemy. And clearly that is entirely a function of cultural evolution. And Rodney Stark has some interesting ideas about what drives that. So the bottom line in response to your question is whatever explanation we have of this has to take seriously and ultimately determinatively the impact of cultural evolution on cooperative structures. However, that leaves open the question of the way in which cultural structures and ideas interact with human biology. Is it, for example, a pleiotropic and ultimately counter-beneficial interaction? Or one thing I didn't talk about, there are a number of things that could be viewed as byproducts, phenotypes which emerge in a novel environment, which then are selected for because they turn out to have beneficent consequences. So the development of culture could result in a new phenotype, which is then selected for. A specific example of this given by Bill Durham in his book Coevolution has to do with herding in African tribes, which was clearly an idea which then drove the evolution of genes in those populations for the ability to digest lactose late into life, which apart from those cultures don't exist.
One quick comeback?
Yeah.
Let me play.
A quick comeback. I totally agree with your response. But just want to say that if we are now strictly in the realm of the cultural and the civilizational, then there's a very big problem with evolutionary accounts, or for the attempts to account for this a rise of different cultural values, which is that there are a great variety of other factors that will affect the prosperity and possibility of survival of certain groups. For instance, efficiency in organization and leadership, and certain very critical historical inventions, like certain military inventions. One example would be, it's not that the Romans were particularly altruistic, that they could conquer the whole Mediterranean world. It's because their military might was based on certain kind of inventions in armaments and organization. Well, but if we're in the realm of invention, and if we're in the realm of organization, then the idea of intentional design by leaders, or perhaps the ruling elite, would be very important. But the usual image in certain game theories or evolutionary accounts is usually an evolution involving a group interacting with members interacting with each other in a rather non-intentional way. That is without kind of hierarchical organization that something is implemented by the elite. So there is this difficulty here again.
Quick reply. That question would be a great question for an entire seminar. But several suggestions. First of all, the anthropologist Chris Bone has engaged that very question in his work in terms of what he calls the ambiguous legacy of individual and group selection, so that human cultures reflect this tension between domination by charismatic and powerful leaders, which can be, by the way, supplemented and enabled by technological developments, and cooperative egalitarianism. So there's one tension. Secondly, I hope you don't think that I was arguing for a single stable point. Different strategies can be multiply evolutionarily stable, and so game theory doesn't suggest that we're just going one place. And then lastly, this idea of the cultural dissemination of ideas. I'm not sure exactly what you meant, that there was tension between that and the evolutionary paradigm. This is a fascinating idea in itself, but one of the things that some models of cultural evolution do is simply apply Darwinian notions of variation and selective transmission to exactly what you're talking about, to the development of ideas and technologies. And then Peter Richardson and Robert Boyd have developed really very innovative proposal which puts these two things together, which they call cultural group selection. How the innovation and dissemination of ideas can feed back in terms of the propagation and success of groups. So lots to talk about and more to read on that topic.
Jeff, I want to thank you very much on behalf of us all. I'm sure that Jeff would be glad to answer any individual questions hereafter if you want to stay and ask him anything. I'd like also to mention that our next lecture in the series is by Alexander Pruss, who's a very brilliant young philosopher and mathematician from Georgetown, who is coming on December the 9th, yes, same time here, and is going to talk on the implications for the latest developments in cooperation in evolution for traditional cosmological and teleological arguments for the existence of God. So that's December the 9th. Jeff, I want to thank you again very much for this time.